Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Monday, August 4th, day 668 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob. Thanks for joining me for another one of our late night for you, early morning for me talks.
They're always a pleasure. Hi, Amanda. Good to be with you again.
Such a pleasure. Now, even as National Security Minister Itamar Gvir controversially prayed on the Temple Mount yesterday for Tisha B'Av, Israel's leadership is expected to decide this week whether to widen military operations in Gaza, even at the risk to the hostages, or to give more time for a potential deal. So Jacob will fill us in on the results of U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff's trip to the region over the weekend and where things stand. Witkoff and U.S. Ambassador Mike Huckabee entered the Gaza Strip on Friday to assess for themselves the humanitarian aid situation there. So we'll hear what were their impressions, and Jacob also recently spoke with some Gazans to get their take. We'll hear if they match. All of this and more when we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Yesterday, a record 3,500 plus Jewish pilgrims were said to visit the Temple Mount over the course of the Tisha B'Av fast day. Among them was far-right National Security Minister Itamar Gvir, who led a group of Jewish worshippers in prayer. It was the first time that a government minister was recorded overtly worshiping at the flashpoint site in violation of the status quo, though hardly the first time a member of Knesset or even a minister has pushed the envelope on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount, just to remind our listeners, is the site of the Jewish temples and today houses the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock Shrine. It can be one of the most volatile flashpoints in the Middle East, but so far, what has been the fallout of Ben Gvir's actions? Jacob.
I would say two typical responses that we've seen over the past year or so, which is you have this flood of condemnations from Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia, that as speculation has mounted about a potential normalization deal, the more that they've decided to weigh in on these issues and try to make their positions known, that they are not okay with this kind of action by Ben Gvir. And at the same time, the other trend that you see in these kinds of incidents is a statement from the Prime Minister's office denying that there's any actual change to the status quo. I guess we're kind of not supposed to believe what we're seeing with our own eyes, that this praying is not taking place, but that's what that's what Prime Minister Netanyahu would definitely like the international community to believe at this point, given the amount of anger that Israel is facing right now from neighbors in the region and beyond.
Yeah, it's still very early here in Israel, so please check out our live blog to make sense if there are any more updates on this matter. Now, the United Nations Security Council will hold a special session tomorrow morning to discuss the 50 hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza. This is after Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar requested this, who he pushed for the discussion after, of course, the terrible, harrowing videos of hostages Eviatar David and Rom Braslavsky, who appear severely emaciated. These were released by Hamas, who is holding Eviatar David, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who is holding Rom Braslavsky. U.S. Special Envoy to the Mideast, Steve Witkoff, was deployed to the Mideast this past weekend, and the hope had always been that he was the big gun to bring about some kind of hostage release ceasefire negotiation deal. But it seems to me, at least, that the talks are not moving forward. Jacob, what do you know?
Yeah, what Witkoff came to the region to do was more focused on the Gaza humanitarian crisis and less so about the hostage release efforts, which are really at an impasse, I would say. He even shared with the hostage families during a meeting on Saturday that basically he has no significant news to deliver at this point, because it seems like we're in the midst of a real shift in Israel and the U.S. strategy, where after the first 21 months of the war, or much of that time, the focus has been trying to get a partial deal This was because Prime Minister Netanyahu did not want to simply end the war in exchange for the hostages, feeling that would leave Hamas in power. Or critics would say he couldn't do that because that would collapse his government. So the focus was to get these partial deals. After time of impasse, the decision now seems to be, okay, now we're actually going to do something that for a long time Netanyahu did not want to do, and we're going to do this comprehensive framework. Now, Netanyahu is framing it as a comprehensive framework where Hamas disarms and Gaza is demilitarized, but still an end to the war in exchange for the release of all of the hostages. That's basically this shift that's now in the process, it seems like, of taking place. Netanyahu is also framing it as we're going to be using military pressure moving forward in order to secure the release of the hostages. So that was what he said on Sunday. I'm not really sure how that's a drastic on that regard, how that's a drastic shift of what we've seen over the past 5 months or so since the last deal collapsed. But that's basically, there's a feeling that the negotiations aren't really working, that Israel's framing this as Hamas is not interested in a deal right now. So all we have left to do is military pressure. And that also, of course, as you mentioned at the top, risks the hostages who are still in some of these pockets in central Gaza that Israel has not gone into because of fear of harming them.
Let's add a little nuance to this. And in terms of the hostage families movement, there also has been a shift over the course of the 21 months. And initially, it appears to me at least that the main forum, the Hostage Families Forum, was definitely on board with these phase deals. But as the war has progressed, it appears to me that they are very much all or none. And that has been the stance of another forum from the beginning, and they've maintained it throughout. That's the Tikva Forum, who has always said there should be no kind of deal in which some of the hostages are out and others are not. And so now these two groups, the Tikva Forum has been accused of being hawkish throughout the war, whereas the Hostage Families Forum has been more seeking a, shall we say, a ceasefire or a quote unquote peace deal. These two forums are aligned in terms of their desire to get all the hostages out now, which in a way is a little confusing because those who are on board with the Hostage Families Forum are also the harshest critics of Netanyahu, who, as you're saying right now, seems to be now wanting to have an all or nothing deal with the hostages. It's very confusing.
I think the difference between both the different hostage family groups that you mentioned, and the vast majority of them, and then this hawkish, and then the difference between Netanyahu saying he wants a comprehensive deal and the hostage family saying it, is because Netanyahu is connecting these two conditions of Hamas agreeing to disarm and Gaza being demilitarized, which are conditions that the hostage families feel, or Hamas says is a non-starter, and therefore hostage families feel will make it very difficult in order to actually reach a deal. I think they're trying to frame what you're seeing as the Israeli security establishment position, and definitely the formers of the Israeli security establishment, because there was a long list on Sunday night who came out and called for this permanent end to the war in exchange for the hostages, and pushing this Lebanon mechanism, basically, that we have with the Hezbollah deal, where Hezbollah wasn't completely destroyed, like what Israel is talking about trying to do with Hamas, but we're able to continue striking in Lebanon. Whenever we see any sort of violation, Israel goes and has killed, I think, over 100 Hezbollah operatives over the past many months since November that ceasefire was reached. And the idea that the former Israeli security establishment, and I think current as well, is talking about is trying to get that kind of framework in Gaza where it's not going as far as Netanyahu wants, which is to basically go down to the last fighter. He's talked about to the last gunman in Gaza. But they feel like the Israeli government has made, or the Israeli military has made enough gains in Gaza to let's pause for now, get the hostages out, and then we'll still be able to continue striking in Gaza if Hamas inevitably they feel violates the ceasefire. Now, I think it might be a lot more complex than the formers are putting it, but that's definitely the feeling amongst them, and it seems like the majority of the public, according to polls, that just wants this to end and doesn't want very strict conditions on doing so.
I'll just point out that, of course, the big difference between Hezbollah and Hamas is that Hezbollah is inside a sovereign nation ruled by others, and the Lebanese forces are, of course, filling the vacuum, whereas Hamas rules the Gaza Strip still. But let's turn to another part of Witkoff's trip. And as you mentioned, Witkoff and U.S. Ambassador Mike Huckabee entered the Gaza Strip on Friday, and they were there for about 5 hours, I believe, to tour one of the joint U.S.-Israel humanitarian distribution sites run by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. So before we talk about the results of their trip and their impressions, let's just hear recent comments from U.S. President Donald Trump about what's happening in Gaza.
So President Trump, I think he was departing on a flight tour from Washington. He was asked whether he characterizes what's happening in Gaza to be a genocide. This is something that Marjorie Taylor Greene, the first Republican to do so I think there's more talk of whether or not he sees it the same way, but basically said, no, I don't see it as such. And he quickly shifted to October 7th being a very gruesome day, something something to the level of gruesomeness that he had never seen before, and continued to talk about still the importance of getting food to Gaza, but shifting away very quickly from this notion that there's a genocide there.
Okay, so one would think that Trump's impressions are colored by the report from Witkoff and Huckabee. So let's talk about what they at least tweeted out. What are their public impressions that we heard?
Right, so Huckabee was pretty effusive, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, about his visit, and felt that the GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was the place that they toured, is doing really incredible work. Whereas Witkoff was a bit more careful. He just said that we went to Gaza in order to try to get an understanding of what was happening there, to try and level set the facts of the situation, and then in order to brief the president, who will then sign off on a new humanitarian aid initiative for Gaza. What's interesting about this is the last time that Witkoff talked about level setting the facts, it was actually the last time he had gone to Gaza, and that was during the previous ceasefire to get an understanding of how things were moving forward, the various mechanisms that were in place to try to keep it stable. And when he returned, we saw several days later, the result of that trip was basically, I think, Trump's big speech in February where he announces his Gaza Riviera plan to have the U.S. take over Gaza and basically relocate all the Palestinians there. He's since basically come down from that plan after, I think, just a couple days ago, he was asked again about it. And he said, well, look, some people loved it, some people didn't, but right now that's not the focus. So I wouldn't say that first Witkoff trip was a resounding success in terms of what it produced afterwards. So it'll be interesting to see if that level setting the facts with the aid situation, what that brings. They haven't announced this new aid initiative yet. I think it's still not clear actually if it will be a new initiative that's moving away from GHF, given that as much as the GHF likes to talk about the over 100 million meals that it is distributing, and that Hamas doesn't get any of these meals, even though that there's no registration of who's getting what, and it's largely just younger men who are able to get to the line first. And of course, the shootings that, again, we had reports on Sunday that 23 were killed en route to a GHF site. So whether or not we'll have simply more GHF sites, instead, part of the issue is that there's just been 4 of them. So if we have more of them, maybe that will ease the amount of pressure that is being seen at each of them. Or if we have something completely different. The U.S. has not given a lot of details on this front. And I assume we'll see in the coming days whether or not there's a new plan or it's just expansion of what already exists.
All right, we are going to go to a short break and then hear what you have heard, Jacob, from a couple Gazans. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. So, Jacob, I have not yet read your reporting on the conversations that you have been holding with some Gazans inside the Gaza Strip about the humanitarian aid distribution. So brief me here.
Sure. So I spoke to 3 over the weekend, and each obviously had their own separate story, but the general feeling from all 3 was that the only people who are going to either GHF sites or to the Zikim crossing, for example, in the north, when UN trucks are coming in, are it's a very small amount of people because of both of those options are incredibly dangerous. That in both those options, you're at risk of coming under either IDF fire, for the most part, which is what they were saying. There are also reports, of course, of Hamas fighters being amongst those there. There are reports of the just armed gunmen that are maybe part of clans that are there, or even of the American contractors opening fire as well. But basically, the consensus of the three I spoke to, and basically they made it sound like it's the vast majority, and numbers would suggest that as well, that people are trying to stay away from those two options and basically are resigned to paying more in order to buy food on it's basically effectively the black market. These are markets like the shouks in different parts of Gaza that are selling aid that's for the most part looted, but it's a much safer way to get the aid. So a lot of these people, at least the three of the people I spoke with, are trying to get money from friends online or just people from abroad. You see a lot of people on Twitter, Palestinians from Gaza who are having these links to their fundraising pages, and they get money that way in order to buy food. Because at this point, the three I spoke with are eating 1 or 2 meals a day for the past a few weeks to even 1 or 2 months, and losing weight in the process. But they feel that this is safer. But the issue with this is that because of the strikes on the banking system in Gaza, basically the only way to deposit money is through this very sketchy system where in order to get the cash, you have to pay a fee. These people that are charging it, they say it's not the people, the Gazans I spoke with, they say that these are not Hamas operatives. I don't know if there's a way to know for sure who's in charge of this cash flow, but basically in order to take out, let's say 50 shekels or 500 shekels, you have to give 50% of that money upfront to the lender, and then you're getting half the money basically you wanted out, or just giving up half to get it. But basically, it's a very expensive process, but still safer, and that's what these people have been doing. But one of them I spoke with said his name was Khaldun Hamad, and he basically said that he just ran out of money to be able to continue doing this and eventually acquiesced to going to Zikim Crossing, which is in the north of Gaza. He lives in the northwest, so it was about a 10-kilometer walk to get there. And he made the trek, was very tired, and finally got there. And there are just tens of thousands of people waiting and eventually pouncing on this UN truck once it crosses by, once it exits the crossing and makes it to near where the distribution point is. And it's just total chaos, similar to the chaos that we're seeing at the GHF sites, but just in this different form. It's by the UN. And he is trying to get food, but eventually he says IDF troops open fire and everyone hits the ground. One of the people right next to him was shot, and he had to make a decision whether to try to continue to stay down in order not to get shot or to try to move towards the food. He eventually decided he was going to help this person and left with him and carried him to a couple kilometers until they found a taxi driver who was willing to take them to the nearby hospital, which happened to be Al Shifa Hospital. And they had to pay this driver, so he had to pay equivalent to $30, and then gave this driver, this very injured person, and he just said he doesn't even know what happened to them in the end. But he then decided to return to the distribution site and tried to get flour, but did not succeed, and went home broken. And that was basically his day trying to get aid. I think this was on Thursday. On Friday, he went back to the site and decided, or he saw someone who was carrying a big bag of flour that he couldn't do on his own. And the man agreed to give him some of his flour in exchange for help carrying it back to their tent. And that's how he got flour for his wife and his mother for the day. And that was just one example of someone I spoke with. There were a couple others who had similar stories about the GHF sites, but it's been obviously very difficult these past few weeks and even longer since even though the blockade was lifted in May, the flow is not really, either due to the totally chaotic situation. Of all of the aid that's now starting to enter, it's still kind of trickling in. It's not reaching everyone.
First of all, thank you so much for bringing this rare glimpse into what is actually happening on the ground in the Gaza Strip. And I just wonder, Jacob, because we are the times of Israel, did these people have any hesitation in speaking with you? Because this has been one of our major obstacles, that Gazans on the ground do not want to speak with the times of Israel.
Yeah, so Khaldun Hamad, I very much identify myself as an Israeli reporter. I think he's desperate to share his story. I think that his feeling he talked about, he doesn't want to simply die and have nobody know about his story. That's kind of the level of desperation that's being felt right now. The other two people I spoke with did not want to speak with their full names, and that's something that's more common with Palestinians speaking to Israeli media, that they're concerned about their safety for doing so. But others right now are feeling quite desperate. And I think just relating it to the hostages, I did ask Khaldun if he saw the video of at this day. I think it was of Evyatar David, and he said yes, I did see it, and basically he felt that the suffering was at the same level. That was how he took it. But how I was just thinking about it as what was so hard watching that hostage video is feeling it reminded me of the scenes that we saw from when several hostages were released in the January deal that looked equally emaciated, and drew those comparisons to the Holocaust. But the feeling then was that at least they were free and moving on to a different stage of their lives. But in the case of Evyatar David and Ron Baslavsky, we have no idea when they'll be getting out. And I think that's what was really gut-wrenching watching those videos. And in a different way, that not the same, but also listening to these stories is similarly gut-wrenching to see how the human impacts of this war have been.
Jacob, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.